Well, firstly, can I begin by thanking Government Knowledge for inviting me to speak today at this important conference in Prestonby. Thank you. There are not many benefits, it's fair to say, of being in opposition, that I've discovered in the last 2.5 years, but one of them is that it does give you the time and space to take a step back, think about your overall approach, look back on your time in government, about what you did well, what you did maybe not quite so well, but also importantly to develop new ideas. And part of this process is about meeting and listening to experts in the field, and that's why I'm grateful to be here today, for as well as giving me an opportunity to set out the overall direction of Labour's thoughts on public procurement, it also gives me a chance to take your questions and hear your views and listen to what you have to say. And firstly, I'll begin by saying good procurement policy, particularly in the current economic climate, is vitally important. It's a major contributing factor to the UK economy, accounting for 1/3 of all public sector spend. Efficiency savings secured through effective, better procurement can also help protect frontline services to some extent from the heavy impact of deficit reduction. However, considering its importance, procurement doesn't always get the attention it deserves. Professor Mark Day, the renowned expert, recently said public procurement, with a few notable exceptions, is massively misunderstood, undervalued and under-led. The transformation of procurement as a discipline is long overdue, with the capacity to play a central role in reducing the UK's deficit and rebalancing the economy. Now, today I want to focus on two major issues highlighted that we're working on in opposition as part of our wide-ranging policy review process. One, how procurement can play an important part in supporting business in the UK, boosting growth and shaping our future economy. And two, how we get the best procurement processes in place across the whole of the public sector to deliver products and services efficiently and with value for money. Before I do that, first of all, I'd like to say a few words about a substantial piece of work that we've already done on procurement and that was completed last year. For almost a year I was Shadow Minister for Defence Equipment and Support, what used to be the old Shadow Minister for Defence Procurement. And during that time I commissioned a 10-month review into defence procurement. It was the first piece of detailed work to come out of Labour's policy review process. Our review team themselves were drawn from business, from academia, from the military, and we met with dozens of companies, organisations, experts. We took evidence from overseas in terms of best practice. It was extensive, open, ambitious, and indicative, I hope, of the approach that we're taking across the board in terms of this major policy review process that we're going through at the moment. The previous government did make important improvements in defence procurement, but we have to recognise now as an opposition that the reforms that we introduced didn't always lead to the necessary and lasting change that we wanted to see. Now, new ideas are needed to tackle the problems which have built up over many decades. The review proposed 35 recommendations. I can say look at the look of fear on some people's faces that we're going to list all of them. I'll spare you the whole list, but just to give you a flavour really of what we came up with, they included thinking longer term and moving specifically to a 10-year financial planning horizon for equipment spend, making sure that the capability that is defined enables the ambition rather than exceeds it. On too many occasions, the quest for the exquisite has delayed the deployment of the good. Shutting down or returning a project to main gate approval when forecast cost or timescale exceeds 120% of that approved. So having the courage to actually put the brakes on earlier in the process, and enhancing the focus on outcomes rather than process in management of projects, and encouraging a culture of consequences for individuals, so whether that's in bonus and pay and career progression as well. So there's a culture of consequences for the people dealing with procurement, and as opposed to what's been dubbed, certainly in defence many times, the conspiracy of optimism. Several of the recommendations also started to shape a new defence industrial strategy, identifying the capabilities that should be based in the UK and those that can be purchased from overseas, again providing clarity and certainty for industry. But my big worry in relation to defence procurement is the potential impact of the government's laissez-faire approach and its almost religious devotion to buying off the shelf. My big worry is that you could see one of our best performing manufacturing sectors wither on the vine. And the government says it wants to see a private sector-led recovery. We all do, but it lacks, in our view, a proper industrial strategy, defence or otherwise, and that's particularly worrying. And this leads me to really the first point I'd like to focus on, which is how we ensure procurement is used as an engine for economic growth. Better procurement is not just about improving processes, but about the ambition we have for certain sectors, such as defence, within the UK economy. I believe we must be constantly thinking how procurement can help strengthen key sectors, support innovators and train the next generation. We must ask what procurement can unlock for the country. With over £200 billion to spend, government is the UK's biggest single consumer by some margin. Procurement can and should be a key driver of growth, opening up markets and creating opportunities for innovation. And that means utilising procurement for what it is, one of the main levers that we have in the economy. But in our view, the government is missing a major opportunity here. Little of the billions of pounds of public procurement is being used in any deliberate way to promote innovative services or products. We saw yesterday Vince Cable starting to move in the right direction in terms of developing some kind of industrial strategy, but it's also fairly clear that he doesn't yet have the backing of Downing Street or of the Treasury, and we need to wait and see what actually materialises from the announcements that were made yesterday. Another problem that I'd like to focus on is about SMEs. Small businesses, as we know, are the lifeblood of the economy, accounting for almost half of private sector turnover, and their success is fundamental in achieving jobs and growth that we all need to see back in our economy. We support the government's aim to increase the proportion of procurement spend going to SMEs. Indeed, this is a continuation of the previous government's policy. But the message from the top is for departments to use their buying power to try and get better deals by awarding bigger contracts. Now, this naturally tends to favour larger suppliers. Contracts become too big for SMEs to win, and larger companies end up dominating. It is possible to balance big national contracts with a focus on SMEs and more innovation, but in practice, that's really tough. So whilst the government has reported that the overall percentage procurement spend going on SMEs is going up, when you look at the raw data, you see that the increase is entirely virtually in two government departments, in the MOD and the MOJ. Now, we welcome that, but when you look through the rest of the list of government departments, in almost all the cases, the percentage of procurement spend going to SMEs is actually falling, including, as we discovered, in the Department for Business, which is actually responsible for SMEs. It's little wonder that the Federation of Small Businesses in a recent survey found that SMEs believe that they are sidelined by central government. So if the government is serious about the SME agenda, we need to see more creative and more concrete steps, like making sure that every department produces a proper, comprehensive plan as to how it will meet the target that they set of 25% of procurement spend going to SMEs, getting proper buy-in from permanent secretaries and from officials, making it a top priority in government departments, and visibly splitting major contracts into smaller chunks to make it easier for small businesses to bid for work. But moving on to improving public procurement processes, the government has made numerous announcements over the last 2 years, many of which we support. Many are continuation of some of the work that was going on in the previous government. So, for instance, we support the publishing contract opportunities through a single portal, reducing bureaucracy and making opportunities more transparent and more accessible for small businesses, and encouraging lean procurement and greater efficiency. But that's not to say that there haven't been some promising new ideas too. The problem is, for many of these, we're still waiting on the details, when or if they'll ever be implemented. And anyone running a business will tell you ultimately everything comes down to implementation, and there's still an awful lot of work in our view that the government needs to do in this area. So for instance, on setting a target of 120 days for most procurement exercises, this could be effective in speeding up some procurements, but we've yet to see the details as to how it's going to be policed. For example, will the Cabinet Office shut down procurements that run over? How will poorer performing procurement officials in senior roles be held accountable? And how will the conspiracy of optimism be replaced by the culture of consequences? On the Top Supplier Initiative, which is looking at making savings out of the largest suppliers to government, this is definitely a positive step, but it suffers from the fact that apart from the top line figure, the details of the savings have not been published. So we're left with a situation where ministers talk of delivering huge savings from suppliers, whilst the suppliers tell their investors not to worry that their profits are not affected. And I've chatted just anecdotally to a major company that's a major supplier to government, and I said, was it just, how's the government made these savings? Did they just get you in after the election and say, welcome to the new regime, here's the new price, and they just hold a gun to your head? And he said, oh no, it's much simpler than that. It made no impact on the company's profits, the amount of money they made from the contract. He said, all we did is we just gave them less. He said, if you want to pay less, we'll give you less. So there's not really a saving. So in a sense, when the government talks about that they've got the same for less, they've actually got less for less. And we get that all the time talking to suppliers, and if you think about it, it does make some sense. I think if the government was more transparent about how it's made those savings, I think that would be helpful to us all. On negotiating with the European Commission for a simplification of public procurement directives, this is something that we really welcome. EU law is often put up as an obstacle to so-called social clauses, and it's an area that we are definitely keen to explore and test the boundaries. How the rules are implemented has been allowed to vary too much from country to country over the years, and too often, and this is my experience of the previous government as well, weaker ministers in all governments have been rolled over by officials who have used EU procurement rules as the basis to make recommendations that are frankly just not the right thing to do by the country. So if we do need, in my view, a change of mindset from ministers, but also from civil servants as well, in terms of EU procurement, about how they draft contracts and where that ultimately taxpayers' money, where the benefits of that taxpayers' money goes. On setting up a commissioning academy, the aim to boost training and capability, that's welcome, but the government plans are still very vague. We've not seen any real progress as of yet. Having the right people in place as procurement officers could be argued as the #1 challenge to address. You can have the best strategy and the best process in place, but they count for little if we haven't got the capability to implement them as well as we might. Before it was abolished, we used to have the highly regarded procurement training programme delivered by the National School of Government. We wait and see if anything will materialise in its place. And of course we shouldn't forget local authorities, schools, the NHS, police forces, all collectively spend far more than central government, and this ought to be a promising avenue for small business. But with the abolition of the Office for Government Commerce, this wider aspect of public procurement is not receiving, in our view, the attention that it deserves. Rather than an increase, there's been a noticeable drop in the dissemination of generalised guidance and best practice in the last 2.5 years. And again, this, in our view, is a missed opportunity. We've got to get much better at spreading best practice and encouraging collaboration. Of course, some local authorities are building on good collaborative work seen in recent years, but there are still many cases of poor, inefficient procurement practice across large parts of the public sector. And for example, a point that was made by our previous speaker, the NAO criticised hospitals for not collaborating enough, saying, and I quote, "A combination of inadequate information and fragmented purchasing means that NHS hospitals' procurement of consumables is still poor value for money." But even in central government, too often departments work in silos. I mentioned before how the MOD and MOJ have made very good progress in terms of percentage spend with SMEs, but that's not happening in other parts of Whitehall. An encouraging step by the government in April this year, in our view, was the appointment of a Chief Procurement Officer to act as a single customer when buying commonly used goods and services such as energy or office supplies. But guidance, support and best practice should be used across the whole of the public sector with effective machinery for action at a local and regional level. As an opposition, we're looking at what mechanisms we might put in place in terms of how ministers and government officials work much better together across government departments. In conclusion, and by all means, please ask questions. We believe that the key here is to align best value procurement policy with the broader aims in terms of your industrial strategy, your business strategy, and your economic policy. And that means working across government, making sure every single pound of spending creates the best value for our wider economy. We saw it in the Olympics, how it's possible to build broader objectives into public procurement contracts, including clauses that require the training of apprentices. We recently announced the Jobs for Contracts policy, which would require companies to have apprenticeship schemes in order to qualify for lucrative government contracts. And it's this kind of an approach that needs to be embedded in terms of how the government does business in a number of areas. The sort of last plea that I would make is we have got this big policy review process. We are genuinely interested in receiving expertise, in new ideas. If any of you have got any of those, you don't have to necessarily give them now. You can think about things that we ought to be looking at, and by all means email me, and please as much as possible contribute to those policy review process so we can get the best ideas for the future. And with that, more than happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, do you have any questions for Michael whilst we have him here locked in this room?
I'll take that as a sign of complete universal approval.
Acceptance.
Every word.
Total acceptance.
It seems.
I think many would disagree with much that you've said, and I think for those of us that are working around public sector procurement for a long time, but have got a very supportive of all that principles, the trick is the how. That is the trick, and I think what we've got, and hence the approach of the core governments that have this trick is to really get underneath that how. So I won't ask you the question of, how would you do that? Because I think that's not a fair question at all, but just to make that point that I think the devil's often in the detail is it's been wrestling with for so long is that, how do we actually make all of that work together?
I wouldn't play down the challenge either. I know I mentioned defence, which is a point where procurement does get into the headlines for all the wrong reasons. It is a massive challenge. Again, anecdotally, when I used to work at the MOD, we would kind of get industry would say, look, the problem here is that the customer, the government, you keep changing your requirements every 5 minutes. You haven't got the money that you said you have for all of this. Your eyes are bigger than your belly. And when you chat to, the MOD, they would say the problem is industry is useless. It can't deliver anything on time and on cost. Nothing works. In truth, I always felt that the truth was sort of somewhere in the middle. But I think there's been progress, and there's lots of good cases in defence and in other departments. I think a lot of it is about joining up, but I think the real challenge, you're right, is actually implementation. And I wouldn't want to play down the difficulty of that.
Yes, gentleman on the left-hand side.
Thanks, Alan Robinson, WBB Architects, you're right, the challenge is the implementation, and actually I'm repeating something I said earlier on today. The challenge for us is with local authorities, and with central government spending so much. And have you got any ideas on how we might make local authorities be
But I think that's something that needs to happen. I think the difficulty is, I think, chatting to people in local government, they kind of, on the one hand, they hear lots about localism, that, you know, you go and do, you know, that's, you know, we're having less centralised approach, but at the same time, they see an awful lot of centralisation, and I think it's how you get that balance right. And the truth is, there's a lot of good practice in local government. And I think the key is how you can get local authorities to collaborate more together, but also how you spread that best practice more effectively. So when you've got good councils who've got really good ideas and are delivering, you know, much better value for money than some others. But I think that's a big challenge.